Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Asuma Katauka and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. As global tensions are rising, the world's economic balance is starting to shift from the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza to the growing partnership between China and Russia. Trade and finance are increasingly being used as tools of power in response. The EU is focusing more on defense and energy independence, but this raises big questions about how united it can stay, how competitive it will be, and whether it can still lead on the world stage. Meanwhile, the UK is trying to find its place after Brexit. Tensions are growing in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the EU-India relationship is becoming more important than ever. To talk about this, joining us now is Vicky Pryce, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research and former Joint Head of the UK Government Economic Service. A leading voice on UK and EU economic policy, she is also a senior member of the British Chambers of Commerce Economic Advisory Council and a visiting professor at Birmingham City University and King's College London. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Vicky Pryce. It's a pleasure to have you with us here. Now,
thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, going on to the questions, my first question is, as an economist, how do you see current geopolitical tensions from Ukraine to Gaza reshaping the global economic order? Do you think are we entering a new era of geo-economics?
We have already entered that new era, I have to say, in particular, of course, not just the geopolitics and the concerns about wars, but also what has been going on in the US with tariffs, which have in many ways changed the world order, the world trade order in particular, quite significantly. And every country and every region needs to rethink how it can remain competitive and also how they can have deals with other like-minded either countries or regions to ensure that the trade advantage that the world has had, on the back of which it has grown quite considerably over the last few decades, does not all get thrown away. And I think that's an important phase, which I think is what loads and loads of leaders are right now focusing on.
Right. And now looking at EU, as EU is transitioning from a primarily economic bloc towards one more engaged in defense or investing highly in defense, how do you see this shift affecting its fiscal priorities, democratic priorities, and cohesion amid energy insecurity and rising defense spending?
Well, the problem that the EU has had is that, of course, it was quite substantially affected by the war in Ukraine, after COVID, and now, of course, the tariffs with the US. But the interesting thing is what has been going on in its own economy. And the truth is it hasn't been doing particularly well, even recently, where Germany in particular has been affected by cutting ties, mostly in terms of energy imports from Russia, and needing to rethink its own structure. And if Germany doesn't do well, then the rest of Europe also suffers, even though a number of southern European countries have actually done reasonably well with the resumption of tourism. And a lot of sort of spending being allowed to happen in those countries under more flexible rules in terms of the deficit and debt, which the EU and the Eurozone actually allows to take place. So what has been going on, of course, is that because of that slightly lower growth, if you look at the latest forecasts by the IMF, we're talking, if we're lucky, of growth of possibly just over 1% in the EU in 2026, whereas if you look at India, for example, the IMF expects growth of 6.2%, and if you look at China, about 4.2%. So we are seeing quite a problem arising, and also, of course, the US doing better than Europe and the Eurozone, partly because it's a little bit more isolated, and also because a lot of investment is now going into the US. So what is happening is that with slow growth, you get low revenues, and what we're finding is that the accumulation of debt that has begun to be in serious proportions in relation to GDP during COVID has expanded even further. And we have, of course, the European Union as a whole borrowing something like 81.8% of GDP. If you look at its overall debt, with some countries being a lot higher, such as Greece, of course, about 153%, Italy just over 130%, and France, with fiscal problems itself, moving up to a debt to GDP ratio of something like 115 to 120%, and with difficulty in terms of being able to contain it. So what all these countries need is growth, but of course they also have to spend a lot more on defense, and they also have to spend a lot more on mitigation for climate change, and even moving countries through a transition period to net zero requires quite a lot of investment, and that's the situation we're in now. So the prospects are that more borrowing will need to be done. What will that do to ability to borrow? Well, on the defense side, countries are getting together in Europe to borrow jointly, and I think that would be quite positive. And also, of course, defense spending will increase up to a point, sort of the demand for production from various sectors, which will spread through the economy. So there are hopes that, in fact, growth could perhaps be improved as a result. But it is going to be a struggle. And this is really why there is also a serious attempt to improve trade relations with other regions, as I mentioned earlier. India, of course, being one. And there are very active discussions going on right now, which will hopefully lead to a free trade agreement between the EU and India by the end of the year.
And now looking at other sides in Europe, with rising tensions between Turkey and Greece over Cyprus, what are the potential economic consequences for Europe in general and this region, and the role of Med9?
Well, the Med9 is interesting because they have been meeting this week, and what they are looking at particularly is defense, but also climate change issues. Greece is a member of that, so is France, of course, and Italy. And those 9 countries are trying to get closer together in terms of ensuring that there is growth in their economies. They're talking about particularly achieving a single market for energy, which will be important, but also defense is going to be a very important part of what they're looking at. But there is no doubt that the tensions between Greece and Turkey are an important factor. And that, of course, has slowed down some of the ability to have better transmission of electricity and energy across the wider Mediterranean area. And also, of course, the tensions with Turkey have tended to cost Greece rather a lot, because its spending on defense has tended to be considerably higher than everyone else in relation to GDP. It's about 5%. And that's a drain, of course, on its own resources in terms of what it can spend money if it wasn't spending it on defense, which is being lost at present. So those tensions are there, and closer cooperation on defense with the rest of the countries that make up the Med9 is, of course, something that Greece is probably looking to improve. Although, of course, there are quite constructive discussions with Turkey, which continue, and also, of course, in the Turkish part of Cyprus seems to have elected a president who is much more inclined to find a solution to the problem.
Yes, we'll be eyeing that. Thank you, Professor, for sharing that. And now looking back at UK, this year we saw Prime Minister Keir Starmer visit with a huge delegation to India, and now the Europe, particularly in UK and India are deepening their trade and technological partnerships. What sectors hold the most promise for UK-India collaboration, and what barriers still prevent a stronger economic alliance between these two countries?
Well, the interesting thing is that there has been a new trade agreement between the UK and India, which is good news. But of course, there are a number of issues which are still hanging in the balance. I think what has been happening for decades now is discussions between both the EU and the UK and India. Of course, the UK used to be part of the EU in terms of closer cooperation and free trade. But what has been going on, of course, is that the demands, if you like, or the expectation that there could be a lot more free movement of people or easier movement of people, particularly from India to the UK, and also, of course, it would be the case for the European Union too, is always a bit of a block. But we seem to have moved a little bit forward in that, although increasing concerns about immigration in the UK are stalling this a little bit. But there are loads of areas of cooperation. On the technological side, for example, I mean, that's a big area where there could be closer work, and I think that is, of course, the intention. On the services side, I think the UK has been pushing quite hard to open up the service sector of India so that there is more investment that takes place from the UK into India. And of course, there's a whole issue of agriculture and what comes in, if you like, on both sides, which is another one, which of course is quite an important aspect. But it's interesting because if you look at the EU-India discussions, there is concern about climate change, as you mentioned earlier, in the sense that the EU is about to have a barrier, if you like, to imports coming in, depending on how much carbon those goods that are coming in have, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. India has been negotiating that reasonably well now with the EU. The UK, of course, is equally affected, or will be equally affected because it's an outside country. Could there be better deals between the UK and India that might facilitate a bit more coming in to the UK because it's easier perhaps to do some of those exports into the UK? Well, all these things are hanging in the balance, I think, right now. So there could be huge potential for greater investment both ways and greater trade both ways. And we've already, of course, seen very substantial investment from Indian companies into the UK.
Right. And lastly, looking ahead, what policy mix should European governments adopt to balance economic resilience, energy independence, as well as ethical foreign policy amid energy insecurity and rising defense spending?
One of the things, of course, that I suggest is an issue is this carbon border adjustment mechanism. The EU thinks it's a very important one, and they need to have that in place to ensure that we haven't simply exported net zero actions happening somewhere else while we're importing things that use quite a lot of carbon, have quite a lot of emissions. So there is a bit of that that is going on right now, which I know there are some deals being negotiated which take into account the fact that there is a sort of a carbon charge for products that are produced in India, domestic one. Anyway, so you could discount that perhaps. So I think Europe is still very keen in this area, but what we're seeing is that regulations are easing a little bit in this area. Europe knows that it needs to be more resilient, more competitive. It needs to rely an awful lot more itself on other sources of energy, and it needs to rethink its structure of industry and possibly move from very heavily energy-intensive sectors to something else, and also unify a lot more, whether it's in the financial sector, whether it is in energy, but of course we're talking about defense perhaps getting closer, really achieving a single market across sectors which have been a bit slow in doing so, and it absolutely needs to become more competitive and remain more competitive against the US and China, and of course in many ways, the danger from emerging markets as well is one that is there. Working more closely with them, including, of course, India, may well be a way forward.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Vicky Pryce, for speaking to us on Focal Length.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We truly appreciate your insights and sharing that with us. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of The Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.